If you take account of the personal equation, it can have a big impact on the value you give to your current or future stakeholders and the value they give to you. In some cases, teams have used it to gain business worth millions of pounds for just a few days' work. It can also help enhance your team's reputation, increase customer retention, and save time, money and effort whilst providing a better service. So what is the personal equation? The idea originated in science in the 19th century. Different astronomers produced different measurements. But Charles Wolfe was able to show that their judgments were due to each astronomer's own subjective bias. He was able to reconcile the differences between them by applying a personal equation to each astronomer's observations. The concept was applied to psychology by Carl Gustav Jung in his theory of psychological types. Today, his theory is most often used in team building, using questionnaires such as the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator. However, Jung used his theory to explain why different psychologists favoured different psychological theories. The same principle applies to your stakeholders. Each individual takes a different subjective view when they evaluate your products, services, or organisation. If you don't take account of their personal equations, you're missing out on the opportunity to improve your bottom line through a better service, your reputation, or the retention of staff and customers. There are three ways of tackling this problem. What the scientists did was to use the personal equation to reduce subjective differences as much as possible. But you probably can't do that. Stakeholders are not usually motivated to establish objective measurements of your performance. Not truly objective measurements. They have different motivations. They need to make decisions that are in their own best interests and in the interest of the organisation they represent. A second approach is to use the platinum rule. This is a more advanced version of the golden rule, which suggests that you treat others in the same way that you want them to treat you. The platinum rule suggests that you treat others in the way they want to be treated, which obviously may be different to the way that you want to be treated. Therefore, to use the platinum rule, you develop an understanding of your stakeholders' personal equations or their psychological type or preferences, and then adapt your product, service or delivery style accordingly. The principle may sound simple, but it's very hard to implement. It means you have to step outside your own personal equation or psychological type and engage with another, sometimes seemingly contradictory perspective, which most people find very difficult. In fact, Jung thought that most people found it so difficult that he wrote that they're often incapable of understanding and accepting any point of view other than their own. They therefore suppose there can be only one true explanation. In other words, people are so convinced of their own viewpoint that they sometimes invest all their effort in trying to persuade other people to accept it. This results in a standpoint that might suggest things such as, we need to convince our customers that we provide the best service or the best value. Or maybe we need to convince our employees what a good employer we are. These types of statements assume that everyone is the same and will be convinced by the same type of argument. Psychological type theory helps to deconstruct our own attitudes, to understand how other people's thinking can be radically different to our own. And it shows us how to adapt to those differences. So far we've discussed two approaches. The first involves reducing the personal equation as far as possible, which in many cases isn't really practical, except in scientific or regulatory contexts. We've also discussed the platinum rule, which is the widely used principle of adapting your style to suit other people's preferences. Jung also described a third approach, which is even more advanced and has an unusual name. He called it the transcendent function, or the third way. What he meant in simple terms is that you find a third, creative solution that transcends both your viewpoint and your stakeholders' viewpoint. For example, in the early 1990s, Volkswagen decided to buy Skoda. This may seem a strange decision because Skoda were not known for the quality and reliability that Volkswagen were known for. But the Eastern European market was starting to open up. And it might have been difficult for Volkswagen to sell their cars directly to Eastern Europe because of the cultural and historical baggage that was associated with the company. However, through Skoda, they brought together Volkswagen's emphasis on quality and reliability with Eastern Europe cultural sensitivities. These principles, the Platinum Rule and finding a third way, can be applied to any team that depends on particular stakeholders for success. However, to go through this process for every individual or group of stakeholders can be very time-consuming. So we suggest a 4-stage approach in order to focus your efforts in the right place. The first stage is to learn more about the personal equation, how to recognise stakeholders' psychological preferences and how to adapt your style accordingly. The second stage is to prioritise your stakeholder relationships. This isn't just a stakeholder analysis, but a look at the network of relationships between your team and the various individual stakeholders. This helps you identify which relationships would benefit most from an investment on your part. In the third stage, you focus on a particular stakeholder and develop greater empathy with his or her personal equation. This is possibly the hardest part because it means stepping outside your own perspective and seeing your products or services through the eyes of your stakeholder. It's possible to do this in a very direct way by asking the stakeholder to make a presentation to the team and to express their views openly. However, this session needs to be managed carefully for 2 reasons. Firstly, in this situation, stakeholders very often tone their views down and they express more positive views when presented with the team. And that can be got around by choosing perhaps the most critical stakeholder, the one that holds the most negative views or most contrary views, or by briefing the stakeholder to set the tone and the climate where they feel able to be fully open about their views. The second reason is that team members may fall into the temptation of trying to persuade the stakeholder to accept their own point of view rather than putting their effort into empathic listening. Therefore, the team need to be prepared to make sure that they're able to look at things from the stakeholder's point of view and not to rush into judgment or questioning. The final and fourth stage is then to take a detailed look at the information gleaned so far, at how you can implement the Platinum Rule in your stakeholder relationship, or find a third way that brings your service and the differing stakeholder views together. This stage might involve tailoring your value proposition to the stakeholder, or developing a new modus operandi, or finding other ways of building better stakeholder relationships. This whole process need not take a long time. For a small team that needs to improve relationships with a single stakeholder, it often only requires a couple of days, just half a day for each stage. A greater investment of time may be needed for larger teams with a complex stakeholder structure. But whatever the context your team is in, the investment is worth it if developing a better relationship with your stakeholders will have an impact on your business.